Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula, and it's time to get ready for the wettest and wildest sprint weekend on the calendar.
B-tier drivers were king heading out of Mexico, but as we know from last year, it was all about the A-tier driver choice. And we are also joined by a very special guest.
To be honest, guys, that's a bit harsh. I'm here every deadline stream.
To get us ready for Brazil, we have a very special guest. He's an F1 insider whose work is featured in Motorsport Magazine, Racer, and F1.com. He's a presenter for SiriusXM's F1 coverage, and just last week we saw him on our screens as part of the F1 TV team. It's the one and only Chris Medland. Chris, welcome to the Fantasy Formula.
Thanks for having me on, Adam. It's good to be here.
Chris, so as you know, we've got a title battle. All season it's been said it's between the two McLaren drivers, but obviously we can't rule out Max Verstappen. What's your thoughts on it, and where do you think this title is going to go for this season?
Very much think Max is very in that fight. I, at the start of the year, predicted he was going to win the championship, and that was despite McLaren at the time, from testing, looking like they had the better car, but I didn't expect them to have so much of a better car as they've had. And I was probably, I'll admit, I was regretting that call mid-season, around the summer. Certainly after Zandvoort, I had no belief that it was going to come around like it is. Now, I mean, Mexico's put a bit of a spanner in the works. I've been more confident pre-Mexico that Max was going to get even closer. But then for a weekend where he didn't actually have a particularly competitive car, to still technically close the gap to P1 was a good step from him. So he's been there, he's seen it, he's done it, he's got nothing to lose still. So I kind of still am leaning actually towards Max getting it done. And the thing I actually really like, a lot of people have criticised McLaren for this. I like the McLaren have let the two drivers fight it out, and that they're now backed into a corner where they can't pick one over the other because there's 4 races left and there's 1 point between them. They can't say, right, we're prioritising Lando now he's in the lead to try and hold Max off. You've got to give them equal shot all the way to the end now. But that also, I think, is going to mean more if one of these two McLaren drivers wins this title. It would have been done not only in the face of pressure from Max Verstappen, but under pressure from their own teammate, and they'll have had to have come out on top on both fronts, and they've had to earn the right to be champion in what is the quickest car over the balance of the season. And there was a point where I feel like, if Max hadn't come back into this fight, some people would have just said it wasn't a great championship because McLaren had the comfortably quickest car, and it's just between two drivers who'd never won one, and it was all fairly well controlled by the team. It never really caught fire in that way. So I like the way now we've got a proper fight across all 3 of them, and they're going to have to really go and take it by the scruff of the neck, whoever wins it. But I'm still leaning towards Max, I will admit.
Zach, this is going to be a big question for our F1 fantasy teams this week as well, because that's going to be our DRS boosted driver, either Max or Lando. And for some teams with a lower budget, maybe Oscar Piastri too. Is there one or the other that you're leaning toward heading into this weekend?
I think it has to be Max for this weekend. Just going off what we know from last year, how brilliant he was, and with just how chaotic Brazil can be, it looks like Max is our standard 2-times driver. However, we're now in a situation where it looks like if you can afford to bring in Max and Norris with McLaren and Mercedes, do that all means necessary, even if it means double Alpine. But then the next best for now looks like Verstappen and Piastri. And then if it looks like a McLaren rocket ship track, then it would be Norris and Piastri.
And this is a question that's going to dovetail right into the constructor debate as well, because over the last 5 races, Red Bull have led all constructors with 320 points. McLaren were 4th with 275 points. But in Mexico, those top 4 constructors completely flipped, and McLaren had a huge rebound weekend. Chris, it's safe to assume that the top driver from these 4 teams will have a good weekend in Brazil. But which constructors are most likely to have both drivers in the fight?
It's still McLaren. It really is. I mean, 1, because of the strength of the car, but 2, that's a track that should suit the car fairly well. It's been really hard to actually say that with confidence this year. Every time you go to a circuit and you think that's the track that will suit X team and X driver, it hasn't always proven out that way. But just the way that the McLaren drivers on the whole have been able to extract so much more regularly from the same car is why you've got to lean towards those. I mean, yes, Piastri's had a bit of a struggle over the last couple of race weekends, but if you look back over certainly that summer run where it was 1-2, 1-2 in different directions for so long, that's where you've kind of got to put your faith. I mean, sadly, as much as I love Yuki, you can't really trust that Red Bull are going to have both drivers at the front. And if you look at Mercedes and Ferrari, you're looking at one podium for Antonelli and none for Hamilton across those two. So you're really, really unlikely to see a double podium from any of the other three teams. But McLaren, you might well get it.
For those teams that have enough budget to afford two of these top constructors, McLaren seems like a lock for you. Is there another team where that second driver does give you some hope this weekend?
I'm actually going to say no in terms of a second driver giving me the hope. I think because, as I've just said, I'm not certain when you've got someone like Antonelli coming in at Interlagos. Could do well. He's done actually very well at tracks that he's not raced on before, and he's approached those weekends really strongly by building up to them sensibly. But it's a sprint. He doesn't have long to get on top of everything. And then with Hamilton and Ferrari, it just hasn't quite clicked all the time. And Ferrari, I just have no faith each weekend I go into what we're going to get from them. So that's where it's been a real struggle to back one of those two teams. With Red Bull, I think because you have Verstappen and the fact he could win, regardless of the car he's given, regardless of the weather, then that's where I lean more. And it's not about the second driver, it's the fact that you could get that top result out of the Red Bull car.
Zach, I want to turn it over to you because thinking about some of the other categories to consider with these constructors, Chris just mentioned a moment ago, having that race winner contender brings Red Bull up to the front after McLaren. But then there's having both drivers qualify in the top 10. You heard it a moment ago from Chris. That's only happened twice for Red Bull since Monza. Meanwhile, Mercedes have never scored more than 5 pit stop points in a race. So what factors are you using to figure out what that second constructor is to pair with McLaren?
Oh, it's really, really tough. I still think right now it just has to be the base of Mercedes, and it's purely on just a budget constraint. Look at it. If you can afford to go up Ferrari, it's also nice. But yeah, it's a hard one because I would just say go over to Red Bull if you have the funds to do that. But again, like we've mentioned, we don't know where Yuki's going to be. And if Max doesn't win the race, then they're not going to get enough points compared to Mercedes and Ferrari. So it really is a toss-up for me between Mercedes and Ferrari each race weekend now. I think it really does all just come down to if you can afford Ferrari, probably go up to them purely for the pit stop points and both of them getting into the top 10. And if you can't, you can still sit a Mercedes, and we've seen it doesn't affect your team too much.
Chris, in a normal weekend, we have 3 free practice sessions. You can get some of that long run data, that qualifying data, and you can make a pretty informed decision on which teams to pick. On a sprint weekend, we have just free practice and the sprint qualifying. So what are some of the things you're going to be looking out for this weekend in such a short amount of time between the start of the weekend and when you have to set your lineup?
It's actually the opening laps. It's the very start of FP1 because there's so little time to turn anything around. Weather forecast is another thing, obviously, because if we get a dry FP1 and the forecast looks wet, then actually don't read too much into what you get in FP1. You could see a different picture. And then you want to maybe lean on some of the more experienced drivers that really do excel in the wet. But it is those opening laps where you just see just how comfortable teams are, because you can start FP1 well and look good in a normal race weekend, and by FP3 everything's closed up. But in a sprint weekend, where you put the car out on track as your baseline, at the very least gives you a higher floor. It kind of makes sure that, say it's Max Verstappen that goes quickest straight off the bat at the start of FP1. Well, that would suggest the car's already in a window that's enough for him to play around with in sprint qualifying in the sprint race, and that Red Bull are on the right track. And as we've seen this year, something where Red Bull has struggled actually has been staying on the right track. It's been that they've not always had the car where they want it, and they've been making big changes during the weekend, trying to find the setup that would work for them. So if someone like that is hitting the ground running early doors, I'm thinking that should stay there. Whereas, say, a McLaren, as we said, you're pretty much going to lock them in. That's a team that has been able to turn things around pretty well, even when they've not been quite there at the start. I'd be amazed to see them really struggle in an FP1 session and not be able to even then get the car into a good position for sprint qualifying. So it would be those first few laps, though, just to see which team looks like it's had the better baseline setup, because that's going to be more crucial in a sprint weekend than normal.
It's going to be a very interesting weekend, and I think a very hectic live pre-sprint stream for our show as well. These tend to be some of the most hectic hours of our week. Now, guys, let's turn over and talk about some of the drivers with the best records at Interlagos. You can see on your screen here, Max Verstappen. He's finished either P1 or P2 in 5 of the last 6 Brazilian Grand Prix, including last season where he started P17 and stormed back for the win. And in doing so, he scored the most fantasy points all time with 77. Then you got Lando Norris, sprint win and a Grand Prix pole in Brazil. But all eyes are on the forecast for this one. And Chris, you had hinted at some of the rain and the conditions over the weekend. Are there drivers you trust more in wet conditions?
Certainly Max Verstappen, but I don't think that will surprise anybody, to be honest, when I say that. I mean, someone like Fernando we've got on there, his record's been solid, but that Aston Martin doesn't always allow him to exploit it. And someone again like Lewis, we would normally have talked about as being a wet weather master, but being less familiar with the Ferrari, less comfortable with the Ferrari, not someone I always lean to as well. I think Max stands out 100% because of what we've seen from him in the past, but that's been the leveler that he's been looking for basically all year. The two McLaren drivers actually can be very hit and miss. That's something that maybe worries me a bit, is that adds a variable where I'm never certain. They've had some decent spells, but also some not decent spells. George Russell, though, generally, when it's been wet, has done pretty well, low grip conditions. See how he performed in Canada over the last couple of years when we had some rain there and managed to really be fighting for wins and take a victory. So George would be someone I'd also look at, I think, of better value. But Max is one that just stands out by far.
Agreed. And Terry, I want to bring you in as we move down the grid a little bit because Esteban Ocon has 4 straight points finishes in Brazil. Do you think that upgraded Haas we saw in Mexico could set up another double points finish for Ocon and Ollie Behrman?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look at it, it's a late development. I've been quite surprised with the teams bringing late developments this year. I wasn't expecting Red Bull to carry on as long as they were, and certainly wasn't expecting Haas to bring one. I think there's a bit of correlation, some stuff they maybe want to some for next year going into the mix with some of this stuff as well. But certainly, if you look at Oliver Behrman, his pace, he was there deservedly on pace. It wasn't a fortuitous position that Haas was there. It was there purely from him coming back. So it certainly looks like that floor upgrade in Austin and all the other things that went into it has given them a better opportunity. And I would say you've obviously got lots of Gabriel Bortoleto to look at as well into the mix. Obviously, local talents and other things in there as well. So I think Ocon, I think Behrman again. I mean, that was a really solid drive. He was under a lot of pressure in Mexico and he didn't even let anything get to him at all. He didn't put a single foot wrong all weekend and he's shown that consistently. And I think he keeps getting overlooked with the rookies. We've seen the Antonelli podium, we've seen the Hasler podium, but actually Ollie Behrman has done a solid job. He's got these 4 P11s where he hovers around the points. He's come back through the pack consistently all season. He's had a really good season, to be honest.
Got a few other drivers here on your screen. Pierre Gasly has 2 podiums in Brazil, so I like him as a low-budget option. And we featured Fernando Alonso on this show for all the wrong reasons the last few weeks because he's had some really tough DNF histories at Mexico and at COTA that he continued this year. But his last DNF at Brazil was 13 years ago, so hopefully bad news doesn't come in threes for Fernando.
And then make sure, if you haven't already, to join the Russell Rivals Mini League. It's great fun. It's going on for 3 consecutive races. Brazil will be the halfway point, and there's some very interesting prize coming along. You have a signed pair of Russell's boots, which I think is just really cool. And I really do think F1 Fantasy have really stepped up their game with these prizes. So make sure you're in it to win it. And then heading into your chips that you can use for the Brazilian Grand Prix. As we know, it is a sprint race weekend, so we're gonna most likely be wanting to use at least one. Now, our top one, 100%, just from what we know Brazil is like, always will be no negative. There's always something crazy that happens in Brazil. We just have to go back 1 year ago to see exactly what can happen. So if you have no negative, I think this is the perfect opportunity to use it. This also comes into the final fix, as if we have someone like last year with Verstappen right down the grid, you could final fix over to them. And then also the other chips that you can use. If you've got extra DRS still to use, you might want to keep an eye on it. However, I still think Qatar is the better option there. If you've got Limitless, you could look into that. But again, be careful because we could have a crash between Piastri, Norris, Verstappen as it closes the gap. So maybe you do want to get rid of it quicker than usual. And then realistically, autopilots, wildcard, if you've still got them, it's a great race to do it as well. So Chris, I have to ask you, are you planning on using any chip this weekend?
Yeah, absolutely. I've left far too many on the table, actually, at the end of the season. So I've got to use one per race weekend to make sure I get through them all. But actually, I think most likely for me is going to be final fix. It's that variable of what we might get from qualifying with the weather, just the way that we might get a mixed up grid, leaning on what we had last year as well, as you say, with Max being far down the order. So I think I might be having to turn to that then. Also because, as you say, where you want to pick some of the other ones. And I think, triple DRS, I'll be heading for Qatar for that one. So I've still got a couple in my locker that I was not expecting. I went early with no negative in the sense of with this run, I went with Mexico based on the start of that race and just thinking, what if you do get an incident that takes out a couple of your big scorers at turn one? And you saw how close it got. Everyone did play fair, but I went with it there just to save myself at that point, and it did okay. I think I outscored everyone but one on the F1 Live League, so I was happy enough with it, but it didn't quite give me the return I was hoping for.
Well, fear not, because Zach and I used our no negative chip at Spa. And we thought a wet sprint weekend at Spa would be bringing in a ton of points for us, and I think it saved us 3 points over the entire weekend. So it gets much worse. So, Chris, these are our buy and sell rankings every week, where we take all of the assets on the grid and tell our audience if we prefer to have them this week, if we prefer to leave them off our team, or if we're on the fence and we need to see how things unfold over the course of the weekend. So, starting in Tier A, some of the more expensive assets, we've got Lando Norris back in the buy category. He's had 16 podiums in 20 races, and this is something only Verstappen and Hamilton have done in this generation of the sport. So he's definitely back in the buy column. And you had mentioned George Russell earlier in the show here. So his first F1 win was at Brazil in 2022. He had a front row start last year, and he has 19 or more fantasy points in 8 straight races. So he is as consistent as they come in the game. But I want to ask you about Ferrari, because you said they can be a bit touch and go. The most fantasy points over the last 2 races isn't Lando Norris, and it isn't Max Verstappen, it's Charles Leclerc. Has Ferrari done something different these last few weeks, or do we really need to see what they bring to Brazil to see if he's a viable fantasy asset this week?
Yeah, I think we need to see how Brazil goes. If you think back to how strong they were last year in both Austin and Mexico, and this is a very different car, but there has been some crossover there. I think the pressure came off Ferrari in many ways. They kind of were realising that the season had gone. Their attention really was turning to 2026. And as much as Charles had said he really wanted to get a win and get it on the board, I felt like he started talking in a way that was, it's probably not happening. You know, we're not going to actually make a huge deal about the fact we're not going to have a win this season. And they just executed better. They just had cleaner weekends. But they also weren't that strong in Brazil last year, compared at least to what they'd done in the 2 races previous. So if you go on that basis, not convinced that they're necessarily going to be ahead of McLaren or Red Bull, or Max at least. And as we said, I think George in there too. So I'd be surprised to see the run of podiums continue for Charles this weekend. Not impossible by any stretch. It's so close between those 3 teams behind McLaren in particular that it is always with the caveat that it could still go well. You can't write anyone off. But I just don't have that full confidence that it will for Leclerc and Ferrari.
And then one name I kind of want to look into a little bit more. He's on our fence in the A-tier side, the premium. It has to be Oscar Piastri because his form hasn't been fantastic, as we know. However, heading into Brazil, we saw last year in the sprint race, he did fantastic. And potentially, if it's not as chaotic as last year, he could also do pretty decent in the race. The issue with Piastri is especially with Russell and Verstappen both there for the taking instead of him, and with Norris's better form, it puts him in a little bit of no man's land at the minute. However, definitely don't count him off. We saw he could still overtake in that car in Mexico. So I wouldn't be surprised if he is on the cards, but I do think it will only be if McLaren are a lot faster than the rest of the grid, and he's definitely in the top 3. Now, actually heading over to our budget side, I want to quickly mention everyone in our sell section because it's actually a very hard weekend to find some good valued B-tier drivers this time out. Everyone looks like they're potentially going to be dropping in budget. Alonso, he's going to be terrible for your budget. Same with Hulkenberg, Lawson, Stroll. And it is getting to that point of the season where you still need to focus on that. But if you do need a Hail Mary, you could go for someone like Alonso, but be prepared for that minus 0.6 million hit. And then you move into Bortoleto up in the buy section of the budget options. He's looking like one of my favorites heading into this weekend. Driver of the day potential, obviously being a Brazilian driver on the grid. It has to be him, I think, who's the big lock on everyone's team.
Chris, so we've got a few spots still left on the grid for next year. We've obviously got the second Alpine seat. We've got the 2 Visa Cash App team drivers and also Max's teammate. What are your thoughts on those? There's obviously some news with Zach Crawford taking that Aston Martin reserve role, which kind of looks like it might be shutting the door for Yuki to go that way, which is where many of us thought he was going. What are your thoughts on who's going where for the next season?
Yeah, I had a bit of a feeling that Yuki was leaving Red Bull and would be done basically within that family as such. And I kind of learned over Mexico that maybe I shouldn't have jumped the gun on that quite as much. And I think that there's a chance that potentially even Yuki drops back to Racing Bulls if he stays within the family, and Isaac gets a promotion into Red Bull, but Yuki is then used as the benchmark driver for someone like Arvid Lindblad coming in. So it could still move around in that sense where Yuki's still within a role. And I feel like it's getting much more between Yuki or Liam. Which one of the two of them is going to get that seat at the junior team? And I haven't come down either side yet. My personal opinion is, realistically, as much as I love Yuki, if Red Bull are not backing him to stay in the Red Bull main seat, then why drop him back down and keep him in the family? That junior team is meant to be a proving ground for younger drivers to show what they can do. I think Lawson hasn't had a fair crack at it yet. This was his first full season, and look how it started with two races at Red Bull and then quickly dropped. And the team admit, you could see it took a while for his confidence to come back. I think he deserves at least a start of next season to show in a new car what he could maybe do. And then you'd put Lindblad alongside him. But yeah, I'm not convinced which way they're going to go on that front. Then if you move across to Alpine, is another seat that you mentioned that is going to be available for next year, and it's looking more and more like it could be Franco Colapinto holding on. His form has picked up. He's been closer to Pierre Gasly. This is a car that is not competitive, though, has not been developed. Yeah, the team fully written it off. I really fear for them, actually, in the sense that out of nowhere, they got a huge result here last year, and it made the season look far better than it really was. But I can't see lightning striking twice on that front. And the car itself, having not been developed, is a weaker car to deal with changeable conditions. So as much as Pierre's performed well in the wet, I'm not convinced that you're going to see much from either Alpine driver this weekend. But if you were to commit to Franco for next year, if you're Alpine, would be quite a good time to do it, because you're in South America, huge interest in him over the Brazilian weekend. So I've got no inside knowledge of whether that will or won't happen, but I could see that happening this weekend, or at least talks accelerating to that effect if they're going to stick with him. But when you're one of the teams that is one of the few with a vacancy, you don't have to rush anything. That's one of the things that I think Red Bull have been doing. I think there was a time where they might have made a decision by now and even announced it by now, but they don't need to. All these drivers are under contract for them, so they don't have to rush in any way, shape or form. In many ways, that puts more pressure on the drivers because they know they have to deliver every second or they could be out, and that uncertainty is not very comforting. But the flip side is, if they can perform under that pressure, they give themselves a better chance of holding onto their seat, and Red Bull might learn a bit more in the period that they still have before they have to make a decision. So I reckon we might be running right up to the end of the season, at least for the Red Bull seats.
It's going to be a very interesting end of the season, and we'll see who gets those final seats for the 2026 season. In the meantime, make sure you check out our memberships only on YouTube, where you could see this episode before anybody else. So let's bring it all together and talk about our top lineups for the Brazilian Grand Prix, starting with the Interlagos, the drivers with the best records at Brazil. So you have McLaren and Mercedes, who are consistently two of the top constructors on the grid, who I think will handle themselves well in wet weather, paired with Verstappen, who's won so many races around the circuit, including last season, George Russell, who's Mr. Consistency, Gabriel Bortoleto, who could get driver of the day in a home race, and then two wet weather drivers in Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly. It's $134.2 million for this lineup, but if you have a lower budget, you can just move from Russell to Behrman, and that brings the price to $119.1 million. So 4 podium finishers and a home race for Bortoleto.
Then moving on to the next team that you could use for the Brazilian Grand Prix. Now, I know initially exactly what everyone is thinking. 139.4. That is absolutely crazy budget. And don't worry, we will show how you can drop this a little bit. However, for me, this is the best team possible heading into this race weekend, and I know quite a few people out there now have around this budget. Now, realistically, the 2 times, will it be on Norris? Will it be on Verstappen? That will most likely come down to FP1. However, right now, I'm happy to have it sit on Norris after Mexico. And then realistically, the double Alpine is the other big point of this team. You really got to conserve your budget elsewhere in your team, but I'm quite fine with bringing them in. Obviously, they're not at the price threshold now at 4.5 million, but at 4.7, but they both look good for potentially increasing another 0.2 this weekend if they just keep it on the track. So we'll have to hope for that. And again, we come back to the McLaren and Mercedes just being the base lineup, because I don't see there being a lot between Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes for you to want to spend more budget on your team improving the constructor. Now, like I mentioned, you can bring in Piastri to this team, whether it be replacing Norris if you don't have enough budget, or if you've got slightly less budget than this team, Verstappen down to Piastri, and it's a McLaren track. Fair enough. And then also, I would even go potentially up from Bortoleto to a Bearman if you had a little bit more money just for that safe lock on the 0.6 million. Potentially not, because a driver of the day, it really depends on how you are feeling yourself. But for me, both Bearman and Bortoleto are the best options there, so you can't go wrong with either one of them.
If you have a budget of 139.4 million and would like to give some loans to the rest of us, do let me know. So, Chris, you have probably the most clever team name in the F1 Live League, which is Doors Still Hadjar. I wanted to just put this lineup out there for you to consider entering the weekend, trying for McLaren and VCarb or potentially Haas, two of the best budget constructors in the game throughout the season. Verstappen, Antonelli, Bearman, Bortoleto, and Gasly. So you currently have 115.9 million in budget with 3 free transfers. This costs 115.8. So it takes almost all of that budget up. It's got Oliver Bearman, who leads the grid with 99 overtakes. Antonelli has 20 or more fantasy points in 3 out of his last 4. And then some of the cheaper assets at the back of the grid to round out your team. What are some of your initial thoughts heading into this weekend on who you're keeping an eye out for?
Well, one, I like this team, actually. That's one that I'm going to be looking at because, I've got some of that locked in already. So it's something I could make happen. And it was Bearman is someone that I am really interested to see how he goes. With the upgraded Haas, as you guys have mentioned, I think that's really good. But I was speaking to Eo Komatsu in Mexico, and he was talking about how an FP1 in Mexico, the first time Bearman drove, it was his opening lap out the pits where he saw he was pretty close to the limit already. And he was like, this kid's got something. Then he said the other time he felt like that was at Interlagos last year. And it was about 5 hours before practice that he was actually called up because Kevin Magnussen was unwell. And Bearman was put into the Haas with very little prep and was straight on it on the first lap. And he said he saw his lap time and was like, wow, this kid can drive. But also it means he's comfortable at that track. I think Haas have got a more competitive car, actually, like a better all-round car right now. It's very competitive in that midfield. But with the upgrade they've done, I think it really gives Bearman a chance. He'll be riding high off the back of Mexico. The one worry is he's riding high off the back of Mexico, and it always feels like anything else after that is a disappointment. You're not going to get fourth again, or very unlikely. But I'm looking at this and thinking maybe the Haas in place of the VCarb as well to go in as the team, because as you mentioned, Ocon's got a good record in Interlagos, and he was good in Mexico. He was doing the one-stop strategy, but he was more comfortable with that upgraded car than he had been in Austin, where he'd struggled with it. So I think there's a bit more to come from Ocon as well. So I think both Haas drivers I'll be keeping an eye out on.
Then finally, heading into our last team selection. This one is rightly called differential drama. The big name in this team is Lando Norris as the 2 times. Now, for me, it sounds like quite a few people are still a little bit scared to move over to him, and it could be another Verstappen top option as a choice. So if you need the differential, it could be over to Norris. As we saw in Mexico, only about 20-30% of the top 500 in the F1 Fantasy's Tools League actually went over to Lando Norris. So he can still be the differential. Then you've also got the likes of Antonelli. I really like the look of him at the minute. He's dirt cheap, and also he's bringing in A-tier driver points. It's incredible the run he's been in so far in F1 Fantasy. And the best part is a massive downgrade. But if you can't afford it and you want someone who's going to increase in budget and could potentially show something, out of everyone else, it'd probably be Yuki Tsunoda. But then again, it's the same as the rest of what we've been talking so far in these team selections. Gasly, holding asset, tends to do well in the wet weather. And Bearman and Bortoleto, for me, if you can get them in, they're such great locks for your team.
We have some tough choices ahead this weekend, and there's going to be a lot of chips flying, a lot of points flying at the Brazilian Grand Prix. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any final thoughts heading into this weekend?
Yeah, I'm terrified that everything we just talked about is going to make me look completely like I don't know what I'm on about with Brazil, because one of the things that is a huge variable is that potential for wet weather. And it's not just the fact that if it rains, it can really mix things up. It's the fact that if it doesn't, you can actually get quite a processional race. You can get teams that get their setups right and run away into the distance. And I think there was a little bit of a leaning towards this should be a McLaren track. In the dry, potentially, if they get the setup right in FP1, it could be. And I do expect Oscar Piastri to be stronger than he has been in the last few race weekends, and you might see McLaren really scoring well. So it does feel like a weekend that could really make or break the season for a lot of people here, and that there might be a few despairing afterwards. But that's half the fun of it. I don't know about you guys, but over the way this season has panned out, and a lot over last year as well, where we thought we were getting confident in where to put our money, where to put our picks, what the form guide was going to be. As the season evolved, strangely, when we should have become more and more confident with it, we had to become less and less confident because the form guide was changing so much. And I've really loved that about the last couple of years.
This has been hands down the best F1 fantasy season I've ever participated in. It's been so fun week in and week out. And Chris, best of luck to you in the F1 Live League. Hopefully you can close that gap to Lawrence and Laura in the next couple of weeks. We could celebrate you at the end of the season. Thanks so much to all of you for watching. We'll be back this Saturday at 8 a.m. Eastern for our live show ahead of the sprint race. We'll see you then.